Hi everyone, welcome back. So this week we have quite a bit of ground to cover. We're going to look at a range of new concepts. We're going to talk about events, we're going to talk about randomness, we're going to introduce loops and the idea of mapping. It's going to be broken down into a few videos. So in this first one, we're going to focus on explaining what events are in P5.js, and we're also going to be introducing randomness. So let's jump right in. I've already created a new sketch and saved it. And just because we will be creating some new functions, I will do this thing I like to do where I put some lines in between the code sections just to make it a little bit easier to see the separation between them. And I'm going to run the sketch. Okay. So let's talk about events. Well, what are events in programming? They're basically going to be functions that come in and interrupt the regular flow of the program. And by regular flow, I mean we have setup. Remember, setup runs once in the beginning, and then it's followed by draw, which repeats over and over. That's kind of our main program loop. So events will be additional functions that we can define. So we're going to be we're going to be using this function syntax here to create them, and we're going to implement these events to provide a section in our code that is going to run only when something happens. And let's start with a simple, useful addition we can do to most of our sketches from now on. I'm going to copy and paste this line here, and we are going to implement the windowResized event. So the syntax goes like this. I'm going to start with the keyword function. We're not going to go too deep into the actual breakdown of this syntax. We're going to have a module dedicated to functions in a few weeks. But for now, just know that we're following more or less the same recipe as setup and draw in terms of the syntax. So we have the keyword function, we have the name of the function. This should have a D, windowResized. So windowResized with a D, sorry about that. Then we have two parentheses with nothing in between them. And then we have the open and close curly brackets. Remember, open close curly brackets are always used to identify sections of code. So now we're creating a section of code that is going to run only when the window is resized. Okay, so that happens when I move this this bar here in the middle, or if I was running this sketch full screen, if you resize your browser window, this code would be triggered. So what could we do when we resize the window? Well, one useful thing to do is to call the resize canvas window. So this is slightly different from create canvas. Create canvas we want to call just once in the beginning. It creates this canvas element that we're actually drawing on inside the web page. Resize canvas basically takes the canvas element we've already created and changes its size. So we're going to give that canvas a new size based on the global variables window width and window height. Okay. So now what's going to happen is when I drag this line here, I'm going to trigger the windowResized event. Okay, so this is these events are predetermined in P5. There's a set that we can choose from. We'll look at them in a bit in the reference. And then this code is going to run, and we'll see that it's going to resize my canvas. So we started at this small size, and now the canvas is bigger all of a sudden. And if we wanted to, we could throw like a console.log here just to have a look. You know, we could say, let's say new width, you know, and then we're going to add the width to this. Be careful with the, and we'll do the same for the height, just so we can see what's happening. Print the height, and you'll see that now if I resize the window in the console down here, it's triggering these console.logs, and we can see the width and height. The width is changing, the height is not changing because I'm not resizing the height, right? So this is getting smaller or wider in pixels. Okay. All right. Let's comment this out. We don't want necessarily to have this cluttering up the console moving forward. I'm also going to change the window width from and the window height in setup just from the beginning so that we start with all the space. The only difference now is that if I do resize the canvas, my canvas adjusts now accordingly. So that's pretty cool. All right. Now for this example, I'm going to move background here into setup. Yeah, I'm going to move it into setup, and I'm going to put nothing into draw. That means I'm only going to be clearing the background once in the beginning, and then I'm going to be able to draw things on top of it, right? For example, Remember, we've been doing this example quite a bit. If I were to throw a circle in draw, right, I can draw on top of it. Now, so far, we don't really have any way of not drawing the circle at certain times, right? This is constantly drawing the circle regardless, because draw runs regardless of what happens. It just repeats over and over. So we're going to implement another event relating to the mouse. So now there's a few that we can choose from. Let's open the reference before we go any further. We're going to go to Help, Reference. We're going to open the reference. We're going to search for events right here. So this is a section dedicated to events. So at a glance, you can see that there's mostly things that have to do with with the keyboard and the mouse. Okay, these acceleration events only applies if you run on mobile devices. Same thing with the touch events. And then the windowResized event we implemented is actually in another category here in the environment, but that's really the only one. So there's a handful of events that we can choose from. So for example, if you wanted some code to only run when the mouse is pressed, right? So when we press the mouse button, we could implement this mousePressed event. So let's do that. We're going to say mousePressed. Okay. So notice I'm following the same pattern for the syntax as the other functions, the other code sections. And we are going to move this circle into mousePressed. So I'm deleting it from draw. And now draw is empty. And now I have this circle into mousePressed. Okay. So if I don't do anything, this program just doesn't do anything. But if I click my mouse, I don't know if you can hear it through the mic. I'm clicking really loud so you can hear it. You have to take my word for it. These circles are now only being drawn when my mouse is being pressed. Okay? There's a few kind of subtle things you can do with the mouse events. So mousePressed runs when you first press the button. Okay, and then if I move my mouse, nothing happens. If I wanted to do something on the drag, which means I press and move, I would implement mouseDragged. Okay, so this allows me to create kind of a crude drawing tool of sorts. Right now I have the ability to decide when I draw, okay, and where. Mouse clicked. A click is a press and then a release. That's defined as a click. So there's a few differences. There's also a mouse move where the mouse moves when the mouse moves, but no button is being pressed. So you can choose to implement any number of these events and do different things with your code inside them based on what you're trying to achieve. Okay? We're going to go back to mousePressed for this example. All right. There's also events relating to the keyboard. I'm going to throw another line here. Again, those comment lines, you don't have to put them in. I like to do it. As you can see, now we have more code sections, and I find for me, it gives me a visual help to separate them. So, but it's totally optional to do that. We're going to implement the keyPressed event. So as you may guess, keypress is going to allow us to put a little bit of code that runs when we hit some keys on the keyboard. For example, maybe in keyPressed, we are going to clear the background again. Okay, so now I can click, right? I could draw something. And if I get tired of this pattern, I could hit a key. And now it runs background. Okay, so events basically allow us to interrupt the normal flow of the program with some code that's going to run only when a certain external event happens. And just for your information as well, in keyPressed, we could look at the last key that has been pressed if we wanted to do different things. Remember last week we saw we have if statements, right? So we could ask a question. If we look at the reference here, we have a variable called key. Okay, so key contains the value of the most recent key on the keyboard that was typed. So if we wanted to say only erase the background when I press let's say the B key, okay? Right now it's going to run this code regardless of which key I pressed. I could say if key, and then we're going to compare that. We're going to say check if it's equal to. So when we want to do an equal comparison, we always have to use the double equal sign. That's very important. And we're going to compare this with the letter B. Okay? And then we're going to open the curly brackets, close the curly brackets, and put the background in this if statement. So now I can draw some random crap. And if I press a bunch of keys on my keyboard, doesn't do anything. Only the B key is going to trigger this line of code. Okay, so we can go a little, we can dive in a little bit. Once we know a key has been pressed, we can check which key by asking a question using an if statement. All right. So those are events in a nutshell in P5. There aren't too many. Again, there's mainly the mouse and the key events are the ones we are going to be using, and they're the main ones available. We have windowResized that we're going to use from now on just to give our sketches a bit more flexibility. Note that when you resize the window, it does kind of erase your canvas. So I'm going to put a background there as well to make sure we get the same background, and just something to keep in mind. If I've drawn something here and resized the window, it will erase the canvas. Okay? So it does clear your canvas if you resize. All right. So let's make this program a little bit more interesting. I would like to make it so that whenever I click the mouse, instead of having a circle that appears under my mouse cursor, I would like instead to create draw a new circle on my screen, but at a random location. So in order to do this, we're going to introduce the random function. And this is a very important and useful concept when we're programming, the ability to generate random numbers. Okay? Think about if you're throwing a dice and then you're getting some random number out of it. This can be a great way to introduce some unpredictability in your programs by randomly generating things. So for instance, instead of mouse X and mouse Y, let's generate a random X value. Okay? So we're going to use a command called random to do this. And the parameters to random, there's a few ways we can use it. The assumption is that if you only put in one number, let's say width, it's going to return a value between 0 and width. Okay? So if you only put in one number into random, it's going to return a number between 0 and that number. And it's going to put the value, so it's a function that returns a value, so it's going to spit out some answer, and it's going to put that into a variable that we create here called x. Remember, this is our syntax from last week. To create variables, we say let x equal random, and let y equal random height. Okay? And just for completeness here, I'll put a comment there as well. 0 and height. So this is going to give me two randomly generated numbers. I'm storing them inside these two variables. And notice I'm declaring these variables inside a section of code. Okay, I'm not declaring them at the top of my program. This is a recap. Remember, that means it means these are local variables. Okay, so they're going to get declared here, and they're going to get tossed at the second I reach the end of that code section. So they're only valid in this little part of my code here, which in this case is totally fine because I don't need them beyond drawing this circle. So instead of mouse X and mouse Y, I'm going to put X and Y here as the coordinate for the circle. So now every time I click on the mouse, you can see that circles appear, but they no longer line up with my mouse cursor. Okay? And they just randomly appear throughout the window. So pretty sweet. We could also randomize anything else we want. Maybe we'll randomize the diameter of the circle. So we'll say let diameter equal, and let's grab a random number from the bag. Now this time, instead of going from 0 and a number, I don't really want to have a 0 diameter circle. So I'd like to say maybe we're going to go from 50 to 250. Okay, just making these up. So that's going to return a random value between the minimum I put here and the maximum I put there. So with random, you can also specify a range of numbers you're interested in, and the random function will do its thing and spit out a number unpredictably between that range. And of course, if we want to see this do something, I have to change this 100. I'm going to replace it with diameter. So now whenever I click, not only do I get random locations for my circles, I'm also getting random sizes. Okay. All right. Let's add one more thing to this, just to make it a little nicer. We're also going to randomize their color. Okay, why not? We're just going all in here with the randomness. So let's randomize their color. Now, there's a few ways we can approach this. First, maybe I'll turn off the stroke. Okay, so I'll disable the stroke so I have no outline. And then we're going to randomize the fill color. So let's say we go and create three RGB values, red, green, and blue. Okay, So we're going to use random for that. Now, RGB values are between 0 and 255. You may remember that from the first video, and that is because 255 is the biggest value we can store inside a byte. And each of these take up 1 byte of memory under the hood. So now this is creating 3 variables, R, G, and B. And remember the name of the variables, right? I'm just picking them up. I'm just choosing those not at random, but based on what I want them to do, as long as I don't pick names that already exist in the reference. So for example, there is a function called red in the reference. Okay, as part of the color functions, there's a green. The red function, if you give it a full color, it will extract the red component from it. So I'm not going to use the word red here. I'm just going to use the letter R for short, because the word red is already part of the reference. So before you choose your variable names, just always, again, make sure they're not in here, and then anything else is fair game. And we're going to apply a fill color based on R, G, and B, the 3 numbers that we randomly generated. And because we created local variables and we call random every time we press the mouse, every time I press the mouse, I will get a new set of random numbers. Just like with the coordinate and the size, now we have the colors. So random colors, we get something like this. One thing with random colors is that random RGB colors rarely look very nice because you get the full spectrum. Okay? It could be anything. It could be a bright blue. It could be a beige, a dark brown. It sort of creates a little bit of kind of a mush in terms of a color palette. One thing I like to do with random colors, if I want to have a little bit more control over what comes out or make it a little prettier, is to use a different color mode. Okay. So just to recap, we didn't do this in week 1, but there are different color modes that we can use in P5. So right now we're using RGB, but we can also use a different color mode. This one is called HSB for hue, saturation, and brightness. Okay? So we are going to change the color mode to HSB, and that's going to allow us to have a little bit more control over the colors, the random colors that we create. So for example, in HSB mode, we are going to be able to say, create highly saturated bright colors, but then vary the hue. So we get a kind of a rainbow of colors. You'll see what I mean in a second. So by default here, HSB, right, it's telling us that if we have HSB colors, then the hue is a number between 0 and 360. And then the saturation and brightness are numbers between 100 and 0. Okay. So we get that from the documentation. Let's try it in our code. So we're going to go into setup. This is something I'm just going to do once in the beginning for this program. We're going to say color mode. Again, remember, pay attention to the case here. I'm using an uppercase M because that's how it's defined in the reference. Very important. I'm going to change to HSB, which stands for hue, saturation, brightness. Then we are going to generate some random hues. Yeah. However, we are going to use full saturation and full brightness. So I'm deleting my other variables. I'm going to use the variable H here for H, short for hue. Okay. And then for the fill, I'm going to use that H variable for the hue, but then I will choose fully saturated bright colors. And that's going to give me something that looks like this. I could also add a bit of transparency if I wanted to. This is going to give me 50% opacity, just to make it a little bit nicer. So in my opinion, this looks prettier than the random RGB, where you could get both bright and dark colors and everything in between. This ensures that I'm getting, bright saturated colors, but I'm varying the full hue spectrum. Or I could choose to only use a range of hues here, for example, if I wanted to. So we'll see in next week when we talk about arrays, we'll also have the ability to create more specific color palettes, like, randomly choose from 1 out of 10 specific colors, for instance, but we'll get there next time. All right. So this is our first example for this week. Just to recap here, we introduced the idea of events that allow us to break the normal flow of the program based on external things happening, things like my window being resized, the mouse being pressed, or the key being pressed, right? And we've also introduced the concept of randomness, which allows us to ask for random numbers from the computer. And this is very helpful because now we can start to program things without necessarily having to manually specify every single quantity. We can say, I don't really care what it is, just give me something at random. Okay, variety is the spice of life. Now, in this example, I have to click, for every single circle I want to create. And eventually, if I just click like a maniac, I'm starting to fill the screen with circles. What if, I wanted to click and then just have 100 circles show up, right? What kind of syntax would I need to do this? Well, this is what we're going to tackle in the next example. We're going to remix a version of this program to introduce the concept of loops. That's going to allow us to do this without getting carpal tunnel. So I will see you in the next video.